Morning, about dawn, a mean mob approached the Hall of Justice demanding to see Pilate. Pilate came out and asked them what was wrong, and they said, "Well, we have a prisoner here to be judged." And Pilate said, "Why? What evil has he done?" And they said, "Haven't you heard? He's been spreading strife and sedition all across Galilee." Pilate said, "Galilee? Well, he's not in my jurisdiction. You'll have to take him out to see Herod." So the angry mob left, dragging their prisoner with them. It wasn't long afterward, however, they returned with their prisoner. And this time, Pilate emerged with his official judicial robes on and took his seat there on the pavement and motioned for the prisoner to be brought forward for interrogation. After a lengthy time of questioning, Pilate looked at the crowd and he said, "I find no fault in this man." But the crowd cried, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "Well, every year about this season we have a custom that we release a notable prisoner unto you. We have down in the dungeon cell the murderer and insurrectionist Barabbas. Which of these two would you that I should release unto you, the murderer, insurrectionist Barabbas, or this Jesus of Nazareth?" And the crowd said, "Barabbas! Barabbas! Release unto us Barabbas!" And Pilate said, "What should I do with this Jesus of Nazareth then?" And the crowd said, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate looked over at me and he said, "Take him down and scourge him." So I ordered my soldiers to take him down to the courtyard, and there we stripped his robe off his back and tied his arms around the rack. One of my soldiers took a Roman whip. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a Roman whip before or not, but embedded in each of these long leather thongs are pieces of bone and metal and flint designed to tear and lacerate the flesh. So that big burly soldier of mine that likes his work took that Roman whip and brought it down across the back and shoulders of the prisoner. And hit him again. And hit him again. Hit him again. 39 times. Many times prisoners die while undergoing the scourge. Sometimes they go insane. But my soldiers weren't finished with their sport. They found an old dirty Roman cape. They draped it around his shoulders. They put a reed in his hand. They matted together a crown of thorns. They jammed it down in his brow, and blood spurted out, ran down his face, and matted in his beard. Then they marched around him and spit on him and slapped him in the face and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" After some time, they grew tired of their sport, and I said, "All right, take him back out to see Pilate." When Pilate saw him, he was a pitiful figure. And Pilate looked at him, then he looked at the crowd, this mob, and he said to them, "Behold the man." And I realized what he was doing. He was saying to that mob, "Haven't we hurt him enough now? Can't we turn him loose and let him go? Haven't we satisfied your bloodlust?" But the crowd cried, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate called for a basin of water. He carefully washed his hands, dried them with a towel, lifted them up, and he said to that mob, "See, I'm innocent of the blood of this just man." But the mob cried, "His blood be on us and our children! His blood be on us and our children!" And when Pilate understood that the mob was willing to take responsibility for the crucifixion of this just man, he looked over at me and he said, "Crucify him." We drug him down to the courtyard, and there I remembered we had two other prisoners awaiting execution, and I figured we might as well get all this over with at one time, so I had them brought up from their dungeon cells, and part of a man's shame in being crucified is he has to carry his own cross. I knew these two fellows could carry their crosses, but I wasn't sure about this Galilean preacher. He was really weak from the scourge and loss of blood. And when he got up underneath the cross piece, and those things weigh over 100 pounds, when he stood up, he started to stagger, but he was able to stabilize himself. And I thought, well, he's young and he's strong. Maybe he can carry that cross. So we began to leave through the courtyard out into the city. By this time it was 9 in the morning and people were already about, and my soldiers had to push them out of the way. And the crowd didn't like it. They spit on the prisoners and they cursed them. They threw rocks at them. Wasn't long after that this Galilean preacher collapsed beneath the load of his cross. And my orders called for crucifixion. And since you can't crucify a dead man, I began to look around for someone in the crowd big enough to carry a cross. My eyes fell off to the side, and I said, "Son, what's your name?" And when he said Simon, I noticed that the head of this Galilean preacher looked up, and there was a glimmer of hope in his eye. But when he saw who it was, his head fell to his chest, and the light went out. Then this Simon of Cyrene, shouldered the cross. We went out through the narrow cobblestone streets, not much wider than that aisle right there, pushed the crowds out of the way, went up to a hill called Calvary. Now the Jews call it Golgotha, but it means the same thing in both languages, place of the skull. I don't know if they call it that because we've crucified so many men there or because it looks so much like a skull. We got to the brow of the hill and we laid the crosses on the ground to prepare the prisoners for execution. Most of the time we tie prisoners to crosses. Infrequently we nail them. This Galilean preacher was to be nailed to his. So one of my soldiers went around. They had him tied now to the cross piece so he couldn't move around, and he knelt down beside him. He reached down in a pouch and he pulled out a spike bigger than my finger. He positioned it over the hand on the cross, and he raised his hammer and let it fall, and hit it again till the hand was fastened tightly to the cross. Then he went around to the other side, positioned a spike over that hand, raised his hammer, let it fall, and hit it again till the quivering flesh was fastened tightly to the cross. Then he went down to his feet, put one foot on top of the other. You know, I don't know if you've ever stepped on a nail before or not, but to tell me it hurts. And the instep is the tenderest part of the human body. That soldier of mine positioned that spike over that top foot, raised his hammer and let it fall, driving that nail through the first foot, hit it again, driving the nail through the second foot, and he hit it again till both feet were fastened tightly to the cross. Then soldiers got up on either side of the cross piece and raised it up till the bottom of the cross fell to the bottom of the hole with a thud. And at that moment, the entire weight of the Galilean was suspended between heaven and earth, held there by nothing more than the nails in his hands and the nails in his feet. The pain must have been excruciating. It must have been as if every nerve ending in his body had been set on fire. Well, we put a sign on top of the cross that said, "King of the Jews," in 3 different languages, so everybody passing by would know the reason for his crucifixion. Now, the Jews didn't like that. They said to me, "We have no king but Caesar. Take that sign down." I said, "Oh, no. What Pilate has written, he has written." And the sign stayed up there. I think I told you we had others to be crucified that day. We put one on his right hand and one on his left. And normally when we crucify men, they're like these other two. They're either whining and pleading and begging for mercy, or they're cursing us and calling us every name in the book. But this Galilean preacher spoke not a mumbling word. In fact, it wasn't until he was actually up on the cross that he said anything at all. And I've never forgotten what he said. As if every word was branded into my mind with a hot iron. He hung there on that cross, and he looked toward heaven. And he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I've crucified hundreds of men before. I've never had one of them pray for me while I was crucifying him. And I remember thinking, what manner of man is this? We had a mob that came out there with us. They were screaming at the one on the middle cross, spitting on him, throwing rocks at him. But I had no idea that in that throng would be his own mother. And I remember him looking at a kindly little lady, tears streaming down her cheeks. And very tenderly he spoke to her. He said, "Woman, behold thy son." Then he looked off to the side at a young fellow, just barely a teenager, and he said to him, "Behold your mother." And I realized what he was saying. He was making provision for his mother while he was dying on a cross. And I'd never seen that before. Well, the other two thieves were on their crosses, and one of them took up the railing of the mob. He said, "If you are the Christ, why don't you come down from that cross, save yourself and save us also?" But the one on the other cross looked across at him and he said, "Why don't you be quiet? We're up here because we deserve to be. This just man has done nothing amiss." And he said to that one on the middle cross, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And the one on the middle cross looked back at him and said, "Verily I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." I remember thinking, talk of kingdom and paradise while they're dying on crosses? Man, they must be delirious. Well, we settled down for a long wait. Sometimes it takes days for men to die on crosses. It's the most cruel form of execution ever devised by the imaginations of men. Didn't bother my soldiers, though. They just kept gambling for his only possession, a seamless garment there at the foot of the cross. Along about noontime, the sky grew dark as night, as if the sun refused to shine on such a gruesome scene as this. And then about mid-afternoon, the one on the middle cross began to thrash about, and I was afraid he might jerk one of his hands free of the nails. Then one of my soldiers lifted a sponge filled with vinegar to his lips. But the one on the middle of the cross said, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." And one soldier said, "He's calling for Elijah." And they all laughed. And they pulled the sponge away. Perhaps it was the sight of the sponge filled with vinegar that reminded him how thirsty he was. His body was terribly dehydrated. He'd had nothing to drink since before midnight. And so he said, "I thirst." And the soldier took the sponge filled with vinegar and lifted it to his lips, and he swallowed. And after he swallowed, he said, "It is finished." And he sounded for all the world like a carpenter who just finished a project, looked it over, looked back, said, "It's done, it's completed, there's nothing more to be added." And then in a very surprisingly strong voice, he looked towards heaven and he said, "Father, into thine hands I commit my spirit." And he gave up the ghost. The ground began to shake. We had an earthquake. Graves were opened up. Dead men walked the streets of Jerusalem. The big, thick veil in the temple was torn half in two from top to bottom. I'd never been so frightened in all my life. I couldn't help it. I shouted out, "Truly, this was the Son of God." The crowd must have been as frightened as I was. They came running to me and they said, "Look, tomorrow's a high and holy Sabbath day. It's not lawful to leave bodies hanging on crosses. Kill them and take them down." Sounded like a great idea to me. I was ready to be done with this awful business. So I ordered one of my soldiers, "Go and break their legs." One of my bigger soldiers came up to that first prisoner and he took a heavy iron bar and he reached back with all of his might and swung as hard as he could and he broke both legs with a single blow. Unable any longer to support himself, his weight slumped to his arms. He began to suffocate, and in a matter of moments he died. And then that soldier went to the one on the middle cross. He reached back to break both his legs, I said, wait a minute. He's already dead. Then another soldier took a spear and rammed it up in his side. And out gushed blood separated from water. He died of a broken heart. He was really dead. I'd seen enough dead men to know. Then the soldier went to the other prisoner, reached back and broke both his legs. In a matter of moments, he too expired. Now, normally what we do, we'll leave bodies hanging on crosses to be a lesson to anyone. You don't violate the laws of the Roman Empire. We'll take the bodies down, though, and we plan to dump them in the city dump, Gehenna. They're to be devoured by the worms, the flames, the vultures, and the jackals. But this followers of Jesus, they gained special permission from Pilate himself to remove the body. They carefully took it from the cross, washed it with aloes and spices, wrapped it in strips of linen according to the burial customs of the Jews. Now the crowd didn't like that. They said, don't let them have that body. They'll steal it away and claim he rose from the dead like he said he would. I said, oh no, they won't. I'll see to that and station a squad of soldiers at that tomb. They took the body, laid it on a stone slab in an unused tomb where never before had man been laid, rolled a giant rock in front of that tomb. Then we placed the Roman seal on the stone, stationed a squad of soldiers, and I ordered them, don't you let anyone into that tomb, and don't you let anything come out of that tomb. But early in the morning, on the first day of the week, my soldiers came running to me with a story for which they had absolutely no explanation. The stone had been rolled away uphill. The body was gone. In its place were neatly folded grave clothes. Two men in shining apparel appeared and said to them, why seek ye the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen as he said. After all I'd seen at Calvary, I'd have a mind to believe it. I had to find out. Could I have crucified the Son of God? So I began to ask questions of the followers of the way. And I found out when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? That at that moment, he was bearing all the sins of the world upon his back. As if you could take a giant magnifying glass and focus it in a single spot in time and space, all the sins that had ever been committed or would ever be committed were focused on him. He was bearing our sins, dying the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God. And that blood that dripped off his body ran down the cross, splattered in the dust, and was trampled underfoot by our horses. We had been redeemed by that precious blood. And it all made sense to me. And I gave my life to this Jesus who is called the Christ. Now, I know you must be wondering how I could worship someone that I crucified. My soldiers didn't understand it either. They laughed about it behind my back. But I figured if he could die for me in front of his enemies, the least I could do would be to live for him in front of my friends. And in time, some of my soldiers began to respect my faith. And some of them also became followers of Jesus. And Roman soldiers make good Christians. I'll be seeing him again soon. After all, he said to that one on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. And when I see him, I'm going to look up at him and I'm going to take his hands in mine and I'm going to kiss the nail prints. And I'm going to say, Lord, I'm sorry. Lord, I'm sorry. I just didn't know who you were. Lord, I'm sorry. And for the next 1,000 years, I'll be thanking Him for saving me. Now, before you're too hard on me, I've been reading this book. I believe you call it a Bible. And this book tells me that Jesus died for your sins too. And just as surely as I and my soldiers nailed Jesus to the cross, and that makes you just as guilty as I am. So I'm going to ask you to do what I did and give your life to Jesus Christ right now. Now, I'm told here that many of you are already Christians. If that be the case, you're called to report for duty. God didn't call us to surrender. He hasn't called us to appeasement. He hasn't called us to compromise. He's called us rather to put on the helmet of salvation, shod our feet with the gospel of peace, put on the loins of truth, take up the shield of the faith and the sword of the Spirit, and assault the gates of hell and set the captives free. He's called us to be soldiers. And we're all to report to duty to Him as our wonderful commander and chief. And today, we're going to honor Him by observing the Lord's table, remembering the sacrifice He made for us, the just for the unjust, bringing us to God.